At 6:15 a.m. on December 1st, 1939, a small figure slipped out of a stand of spruce into a wide clearing and raised a rifle without a telescopic sight. Frost crusted his eyebrows. His breath vaporized into the air and vanished. He peered down the iron sights of a Mosin Nagant M 2830, felt the cold bite through his gloves and squeezed the trigger. In minutes, he fired again and again, each report a sharp punctuation in the frozen silence. By noon, soldiers on both sides would be whispering rumors. By weeks, one side would call him the White Death. By decades, the story would be measured and remeasured. Per Finnish wartime records, he was credited with more than 500 confirmed sniper kills, an extraordinary number that fed headlines and myth. Other sources treated that figure with skepticism. Some wartime Soviet accounts and later historians offered lower estimates. The truth sits somewhere between bravado and ledger. This is not a tale of supernatural weaponry, but of human skill stretched to an almost unbelievable extreme, and of a state that answered with mass tactics that could be called in a strategic sense an ultimate weapon. This is a story about Simo Heiha, a compact Finnish rifleman, a farmer who hunted to feed his family and learned to squeeze a trigger not for sport, but for survival. It is also a story about the Soviet Union's response, how doctrine and overwhelming materiel were marshaled to blunt one man's lethal effectiveness. It is a story about how technique met technology, how local knowledge became a force multiplier, and how rumor and fear inflated the smallest facts into a legend. We begin at the clearing where cold smelled like iron and snow. Leave a comment below. Where are you watching from? He was not a towering soldier in a polished uniform. Simo Heiha was short, about 1.52 meters, and built like the land he worked, compact, lean, and weathered. He had been born and raised in the forest and lake country of northern Finland, in a village where winter was the rule and scarcity the teacher. Hunting with small caliber rifles and shotguns had taught him the economy of ammunition. Every round had to count. There had been competitions and rifle clubs in his youth, and years of practice that went beyond formal shooting into the realm of craft. When the Soviet invasion of Finland began in late November 1939, he reported to a wartime position because the defense of his homeland was not an abstraction. It was a direct continuation of the things that had fed and clothed his family. The winter of 1939-1940 in northern Finland was not simply cold, it was merciless. Temperatures could sink below -30 degrees Celsius, and in sheltered pockets the air could approach levels that turned metal brittle and noses numb. These conditions shaped every tactical choice. Clothing meant the difference between alertness and hypothermia. Breath would fog optics and freeze your eyelashes. Tracks showed in the snow like a ledger of movement. For a marksman, the environment was both ally and enemy. It muffled steps but made movement more visible. It allowed for camouflage that would be invisible in summer, but also forced every exposed surface into a white signature that could betray a figure in silhouette. Simo's principal long arm was a Mosin Nagant M 2830, a Finnish variant of the Russian World War I rifle, robust and heavy, fitted with fixed iron sights. He also carried a Suomi KP-31 submachine gun for close fighting when lines compressed. The Mosin was not a precision sniper's instrument as the modern viewer might imagine. It was a bolt-action service rifle, reliable in the cold and, crucially, suitable for a marksman who preferred the immediacy and reliability of iron sights in sub-zero conditions. Scopes in that winter could frost over, break, or reveal position. When Soviet optics were available, they had their advantages at distance, but they came with trade-offs: weight, fragility, and a higher profile. Simo would briefly test a captured Soviet scope and, according to Finnish reports, reject it for reasons of practicality. He trusted familiarity over marginal advantage. The first documented kills, those that began the rumor mill, were the product of small, precise actions. On December 1st, he had no bodyguard detail, no overwatch team. He had skill, a position learned and chosen from local knowledge, and the patience his way of life had taught him. To understand what made those first shots lethal, you must imagine a hunter who has become a soldier. The quiet that precedes the breath, the stillness that holds a moment like a string. The rifle is heavy, but that weight steadies the body. The iron sights draw a narrow slice of white at the target's shoulder or helmet. He compensates for wind not by instruments but by feeling, by watching the way the smoke of a neighbor's shot curls in a certain eddy. He aims, squeezes, and the sound dying in the trees is the same as in any hunting camp. A single conclusion to a long observation. Tactically, his engagements were simple and brutal in their effectiveness. He favored elevated positions and natural concealment, snowdrifts, low mounds, the gray base of a spruce, rather than fixed emplacements. He shot from the prone position, low to minimize silhouette. After firing, he did not linger. He moved to another position, leaving behind a trail that was difficult to follow in white terrain if the tracker did not know exactly where to look. He used the snow to his advantage, not only for camouflage but as a tool for deception. Finnish accounts describe him filling his mouth with snow to prevent his breath from fogging and to avoid revealing himself with a visible plume. When he fired, the recoil kicked the rifle back into the snowbank, and the flash, muffled by the powder and the brief light of winter morning, could be mistaken for a harmless sparkle of ice. Within days, opposing soldiers noticed. Soviet patrols that had previously pressed forward with local impunity began to register holes in their lines and voices that stopped mid-sentence. Machine gunners and officers were disproportionately affected, targets chosen by a marksman who knew the tactical value of eliminating those who coordinated fire and suppressed movement. Where earlier harassment had been opportunistic, these new losses had the hallmarks of deliberate targeting. A single shot to the head or chest, the removal of radio operators, men who carried maps, officers who signaled battalion movements. Each precision strike carried an outsized effect. A machine gun silenced, a radio operator gone, a platoon's nerves frayed. There is a human ugliness to the calculus of such work. A hunter turns predator in a new register. The pillar of skill becomes an instrument in a geopolitical struggle. The narration of kills must therefore be careful. Finnish wartime records later credited Simo with over 500 sniper kills. That number has been repeated often, but we must distinguish two things: the wartime records that Finnish commanders logged and the way numbers ballooned in retellings and enemy reports. Soviet accounts spoke of a ghost, the White Death, a demoralizing myth perhaps as useful on the battlefield as artillery. Propaganda courted the figure for advantage, and fear amplified reports. Our narrative will respect the Finnish documented figures as extraordinary, and also accept that memory and rumor inflated certain aspects. Those first days were not only about shooting. They were laboratories in improvisation. Simo and a handful of fellow riflemen adapted hunting tradecraft to warfare. Breath control, the steady, controlled exhale that prevents a shooter's body from rocking, became vital at weight in 0-degree air. Movement needed to be deliberate, not jerky. When changing positions, he used snow tunnels and small depressions, sinking just enough to hide his outline. When a fellow soldier needed to cross an exposed area, he would watch for patterns in enemy patrols and pick moments between sweeps. He prioritized targets not by numerics but by effect: officers, machine gunners, radio operators, sightsmen. Ammunition conservation had been drilled into him by necessity. Every shot had to either disrupt command and control or silence a weapon that threatened movement. Word spread among Finnish ranks. Commanders noted the impact of a solitary rifleman disrupting enemy formations. In one company report, a commander recorded the presence of an exceptionally effective marksman. He did not yet know the full tally, but he saw men move differently, hesitance replacing the nerve that had been earlier present. This shifting psychology is a critical part of the story. A single uncertain threat can alter whole unit behaviors. Soviet soldiers began to move with more caution, to linger behind cover, to call in suppression fire before advancing. The cost of this caution was momentum, the ebbing of aggression as uncertainty heightened. The Soviets did not respond by mysticism or superstition. They responded with doctrine and force. At first they tried simple measures: patrols with more scouts, increased numbers, and attempts to flush out shooters with return fire. They sent groups to sweep likely vantage points, laid bait, and tried to force the marksman into revealing himself. These tactics often failed because they misunderstood the marksman's advantages. Where the Soviets applied numbers in open, obvious ways, the Finns used micro-knowledge of terrain and the economy of shots. When Soviet patrols confronted Finnish countermeasures, they found themselves in a pattern of losses that seemed to come from nowhere, as if the winter itself had learned to aim. One of the first Soviet countermeasures to take on a more systematic form was the establishment of counter-sniper units. Rather than throw massed infantry at a problem, they began to train teams to seek marksmen deliberately. These small teams were tasked with calling fire, observing potential firing lines, and using coordinated stalking to trap shooters. In late December and January, as reports accumulated, the Soviets assigned more resources to this task: specialized detachments, reconnaissance patrols using different tempos, and attempts to emulate the hunter's stealth. On paper, this was a reasonable adaptation. Match stealth with stealth, precision with precision. But adaptation on paper is not adaptation in practice. The Finnish marksmen, including Simo, did not simply stay in the same position and wait. Their trade was mobility combined with low-profile observation. Counter-sniper teams often relied on predictable patterns. When a shooter failed to show up in one location, they searched the most obvious alternatives. The Finns, having lived and hunted in these forests for generations, moved in ways counterintuitive to outsiders. Trails that looked fresh to a novice might mean nothing to a hunter who read animal tracks rather than boot prints. The snow could be reshaped, footsteps disguised, and scent minimized. In more than one encounter, Soviet teams walked into ambushes laid by Finns who had anticipated such sweeps. At the same time, the Soviet command was not only adjusting tactically, it was adjusting operationally. When small adaptations failed to produce an effect, commanders resorted to overwhelming force. Artillery began to saturate sectors where the marksman was suspected to operate. Barrages were intended to deny the ground by turning it into a sheet of noise and craters. Aircraft reconnaissance and strafing runs added another layer. If the marksman moved, the massed fires would either suppress him or, failing that, make the area too costly to hold. The logic was simple: deny the individual the ground that made his technique possible. In strategic terms, this is the ultimate weapon concept. When precision fails, the state deploys mass. The Finns had little capacity to match indiscriminate bombardment. They had instead to disperse, hide, and pick fights on their terms. The psychological effect of this escalation was twofold. For Finnish defenders, it meant a greater risk each time they exposed themselves. The cost of movement rose. For Soviet soldiers, the use of heavy bombardment suggested a nervousness within command structures. If an individual sniper could force such a response, his operational effect had exceeded what raw statistics alone might suggest. The orders changed. Frontline rules of engagement became more rigid, movement was restricted, and soon enough the Soviets began to coordinate attacks with artillery and armor support where possible. The state could not turn back time on individual losses. It could throw more resources at the problem until the battlefield itself was altered into a tool of attrition. Back in the cover of spruce, Simo continued to work by principles that were not mysterious. His techniques, distilled later by his comrades and by observers, read like a hunter's manual adapted to war. Some of the rules he used were almost obvious once stated. Others were refinements gained from seasons of practice. He kept his position low. He avoided silhouette. He repositioned after a few shots. He prioritized high-value targets, and he conserved ammunition. He made the snow his friend, using its insulative qualities to muffle sounds and its blankness to hide outlines. He used breath control that compensated not only for recoil but for visible vapor in the air. He avoided optics when they offered fragility without sufficient gain. He kept his rifle's metal parts warm enough by frequent handling to prevent dexterity loss from numb hands. These were not secrets so much as disciplined applications of craft. One tactical vignette often cited by those who observed him involves a morning patrol where he identified a Soviet machine gun emplacement that dominated a narrow lane. He waited until a runner, an officer or courier carrying papers, emerged from behind a low knoll, aimed, and fired a single perfect shot. The machine gun fell silent. The patrol's command nerve unraveled. Later that day, Finnish scouts reported that the enemy's movement slowed as the runs of ammunition and communications were interrupted. The chain reaction of one bullet was not magical. It was the calculated elimination of a node in the adversary's system. An officer down meant delays and confusion. A machine gun out of action meant safer movement for small units. Over time, these micro-effects could aggregate into operational friction. The Soviets, for their part, began to analyze patterns. Lieutenant Yevgeny Nikolaev, an analyst mentioned in Finnish and Soviet notes, started collecting after-action reports and mapping probable firing sectors. The analytical approach recognized what was intuitively obvious to the Finns. The marksman was not omniscient, but he was mobile, patient, and able to exploit the terrain. Captain Viktor Medvedev, a commander put in charge of a counter-sniper detachment, tried to impose method on chaos. He trained his men to watch for subtle signs. A tuft of fur caught on a branch where a hat brushed by, the faint disturbance of wind in the snow, the way sunlight hit a suspicious mound. They attempted to bait and trap to use false targets and decoys. On several occasions, they closed on positions only to find them abandoned, the shooter a ghost in the white. These tactical failures did not go unremarked in Soviet dispatches. Reports later acknowledged the difficulty of offsetting a highly skilled local marksman with conventional methods. In response, the Soviet Union deployed more aggressive approaches. Larger sweeps, decoy units designed to draw fire, and the aforementioned artillery barrages. All the while, propaganda worked in parallel. turning fear and uncertainty into narrative. Where soldiers feared an invisible enemy, newspapers could turn that fear into myth, and myth into a weapon that hamstrung morale. The Finnish side, too, used the imagery, carefully and often with restraint, because the psychological effect on the enemy and on one's own troops was a force multiplier. Amidst this strategic exchange, Simo's personal style remained austere and practical. He rarely, if ever, used a telescopic sight, not out of romantic purism, but because harsh winter conditions rendered optics less reliable. Scopes could fog or be knocked out of zero by extreme cold. They increased the shooter's profile and required frequent adjustment. For Simo, the iron sight offered simplicity, a rugged interface between eye, barrel, and target. It demanded more from the shooter in terms of skill, judging range, compensating for drop, aligning sight picture, but it also allowed a faster cadence and less failure. In an environment where competence could mean survival, the fewer moving parts the better. As the weeks advanced, the cumulative effect of his operations forced changes in doctrine well beyond the tactical level. Soviet commanders learned that a single, mobile, and skilled marksman could create disproportionate disruption. They started to integrate counter-sniper doctrine into larger operational planning. They became more willing to commit heavy assets to sectors where an individual threat was suspected. The result was not a single super weapon, but a suite of coordinated responses, tactical adaptation, material escalation, and a public relations campaign that turned a man into a symbol. In that sense, the ultimate weapon of the USSR was not a piece of hardware, but the capacity of a centralized state to reallocate firepower, manpower, and narrative in a synchronized manner. The Finnish defense, small and resource-limited compared to the Soviet war machine, adapted in other ways. Small unit tactics emphasized mobility and stealth rather than fixed defense. Troops learned to trust local guides and hunters who could read snow like a ledger. Commanders prioritized preserving initiative where possible, striking hard where the enemy was least prepared and melting away before the weight of Soviet retaliation could be brought to bear. This asymmetric mindset of working smart when you cannot work big underpinned the effectiveness of marksmen like Simo. He was not an isolated anomaly, but a node in a broader system that favored the clever use of limited resources. Within the Finnish records, there are accounts that detail the psychological strain on snipers tasked with this work. Those who kill even when justified by defense rarely emerge unchanged. Men recorded a kind of numbness, a weary focus in which action becomes a sequence of necessary tasks rather than a moral inventory. In private journals and veteran interviews conducted after the war, some Finnish shooters expressed regret or discomfort with their role. Simo himself in later years would be reported to have felt ambivalent about the label White Death, preferring to be remembered, if at all, as someone who did his duty. These human notes complicate the clean hero narratives. Proficiency at killing is not the same as celebrating killing. By mid-January, the Soviets had escalated from surgical attempts to systematic pressure. Artillery and aerial persecution increased. Where before a marksman might shape a small area of battlefield influence, now that area could be turned into a landscape of shattered trees and churned snow. Barrages complicated movement and made concealment trickier. Craters and shattered branches created new silhouettes for spotters to exploit, and the din could either mask or betray a shooter's position depending on how it was managed. The tactical balance had shifted. The operating environment became more dangerous not just from targeted fire but from the side effects of massed shells. This period also marked the deepening of myth. Soviet troops began to trade stories of a man who could strike from beyond sight, someone who moved like an animal in the snow. Finnish listeners, for their part, recognized the effectiveness but also the human cost. It is striking how quickly the technical precision of a marksman's work can be reframed into mythology. A single comprehensible practice, aim, breathe, squeeze, turns into legend in the fog of war. We must always separate the mechanical skill from the human narratives that accrete to it. The scene returns for a moment to a winter morning in the forest. Light is thin and grey. The day feels as if it would never warm. A column of soldiers begins to move, cautious now because the memory of a single shot persists like a bruise. Somewhere in the trees, a man with an iron-sighted rifle watches not for glory but for survival. His actions measured, his decisions shaped by decades of living with the land. On the other side, a state apparatus reorders its forces, committing artillery and specialized units to blunt what a small, dedicated craftsman has managed to disrupt. Neither side is purely heroic nor villainous. Both operate within a violent economy of means and ends, consequence and necessity. At this juncture in the story, patterns are emerging but no arc has closed. Simo's technique is established. Soviet responses are intensifying. The battlefield itself is changing, from places where micro-skill can dominate to theaters where raw force seeks to drown out the advantage small units can achieve. The tension between skill and scale, person and machine, quiet craft and loud response begins to define the coming months. The narrative will later converge on a crucial moment when those forces collide with devastating consequences. For now, the forest holds its breath, and the snow keeps the secret of where the next shot will come from. The winter pressed on, and the ordinary laws of battle began to bend under an extraordinary pressure. By January, the front lines around Simo-Heiha's sector had turned into a tessellation of shell holes and frozen corpses, a landscape carved by a war that answered precision with volume. The small strikes that had once altered patrol tempos and commanders' decisions were now colliding with institutional responses. Doctrine adapting to discomfort, resources thrown in to blunt a problem that a single man had exposed. The story that began in a white clearing, one rifle, one steady hand, one lifetime of hunting, expanded into an operational conversation between a localized craft and a state prepared to make the battlefield itself the instrument of its answer. Soviet commanders, frustrated by attrition and by the psychological weight of an unseen adversary, layered measures. Reconnaissance intensified. Radio traffic was monitored and dissected. Small detachments of counter-snipers were formed and redeployed. Lieutenant Yevgeny Nikolaev's analytical maps, notes of probable sectors, clipboards annotated with time-of-day patterns, became a thread through intelligence reports. Captain Viktor Medvedev, charged with leading one of the specialized detachments, applied a soldier's logic, trained teams to identify likely firing points, bait suspected positions with feints and decoys, and coordinate stalking approaches that minimized exposure to long-range marksmen. The detachment's methods were methodical. Observe, trap, close. Yet for every advance in technique, the Finns offered a living curriculum in evasion. The counter-snipers' problems were not simply tactical. They were environmental and cultural. Men raised in plains or urban barracks often read a winter forest as a blank map, not as a palimpsest of animal trails, wind grooves, and wood smoke stains. Where an outsider might track by boot impressions, a hunter read by the weights of branches and the direction of minor wind eddies. Snow could be sculpted to hide steps. Breath could be muffled by teeth packed with cold snow to avoid revealing a vapor plume. A hat's fur could be pressed at an angle to catch or bounce sunlight away from eyes. These were not charms. They were applied, repeated practices, the kind that become instinct after a life lived outdoors. The Soviet teams, exacting and determined, sometimes closed on places already abandoned or found traps laid for them. In the few engagements that went the other way, counter-sniper training met its match in the improvisational camouflage and movement of seasoned hunters turned soldiers. When small unit tactics failed to dislodge the threat, the Soviets turned to mass. Barrages began to shape the environment. Craters opened like black mouths in the snow. Trees were sheared into threatening silhouettes. The ground, once navigable by a single man's stealth, became laced with hazards and exposed patches. Aircraft added another dimension. Reconnaissance flights that tried to spot movement from above, strafing that could deny certain flanks. The logic was brutal and clear. Deny the man the terrain that had made him effective. If a single shooter could move the behavior of entire units, then altering that terrain with overwhelming firepower was a feasible if costly remedy. This was the operational translation of what some contemporaries called the ultimate weapon. Not a gun that outshot a man, but the state's capacity to change the battlefield through weight of fire, coordination, and attrition. That phrase, ultimate weapon, should be read as a strategic shorthand rather than a literal claim. The Soviet Union did not deploy a mystical instrument. It deployed doctrine, logistics, manpower, and an inclination, born of centralized command, to marshal them relentlessly. In practice, that meant combined arms, artillery barrages timed with infantry pushes, reconnaissance overhead, and armored columns where terrain permitted. In sectors where a single marksman's effects were felt disproportionately, commanders learned to weigh the cost of continuing localized pressure against the broader needs of the front. In other words, the answer to one man's craft became systemic, suppression by volume where precision could not be matched. Each escalation carried consequences. For Finnish defenders, the risk calculus changed. Movement became more expensive. Once suitable routes were now funnels to death by bombardment. The psychological terrain shifted as well. Where a vigilant soldier had once trusted skill and stealth, he now had to account for the blunt instrument of attrition. For Soviet soldiers, the spectacle of seeing vast barrages thrown at a forest patch bred its own kind of unease. Officers questioned where intelligence had failed, where a single rifle had gained such tactical leverage, and what that said about command. Propaganda took up the story in its own register. The rumor of a ghost, White Death, echoed outward, helping both sides. For the Finns, a symbol of resistance, for the Soviets, a cautionary tale and a reason to invest more heavily in suppression. Myth and tactic fed each other. Between the exchanges of force and rumor, Simo continued to operate in a mode that was as much survival as technique. His movement patterns, observed and later systematized by comrades, were simple in description but elevated in execution. He kept engagements brief. He prioritized high-value targets. He reset his position after a handful of shots. He used the snow not only for concealment but as a living tool, mounding it to absorb muzzle blast, sinking into depressions to lower silhouette, pressing his rifle barrel into a snowbank to steady aim. He wrapped cloth around metal parts to keep them from seizing in the cold. He conserved rounds, making each shot count because scarcity had taught him that every cartridge was an expensive resource. These were the mechanics of efficacy. They were not poetic, only efficient. For students of marksmanship and of small unit tactics, Simo's practice can be reduced to a set of principles that are teachable and observable. Finns who served with him and later historians synthesized these into clearer rules, practical, transferable, and grimly effective. They were not mystical secrets, they were disciplined choices. Presented here as a distilled set of 10 rules, they read like a manual for a hunter in war. Each rule is followed by a short explanation and concrete example drawn from operational context. 1. Stay low and break the silhouette. A human shape against a white backdrop is a focal point. By remaining prone or snug in depressions, a shooter reduces the chance of being singled out by a glance or a scope. One documented action shows attackers passing within meters of a concealed mound because the silhouette had been sufficiently broken by snow and gear. 2. Move after firing. Repetition is a locator. After 2 or 3 shots, a position becomes suspect. Simo adopted a rhythm. Shoot, listen, and then relocate. On days when Soviet patrols closed to sweep his initial site, they found only disturbed snow and the ghost of tracks that led away in unexpected directions. 3. Prioritize targets for effect, not for score. Eliminating an officer or a radio operator multiplies tactical returns. The machine gunner who dominates a lane is more valuable as a target than a private, because removing him shifts the enemy's field of maneuver. 4. Conserve ammunition. Make each round have purpose. Years of hunting and village economy teach restraint. Simo's recorded engagements reflect patient pauses and two-shot solutions rather than long, indiscriminate fusillades. 5. Use environmental camouflage actively. Snow is camouflage only to those who understand its textures. He sculpted snow to break edges, used spruce branches to cast false shadows, and timed movement with the sun and wind to minimize reflection or vapor. 6. Control breath and minimize signs of life. The crude trick of packing snow in the mouth to stop visible plumes is emblematic. Small adjustments to physiology can prevent detection. In thin air, a breath can betray a position. Controlling breathing is as tactical as zeroing a sight. 7. Prefer reliable, simple equipment in extreme conditions. Optics can fog, freeze, or be knocked from zero. Iron sights, though less forgiving, are resilient. The Mosin Nagant's weight, steadied shots, and tolerances allowed consistent function in sub-zero temperatures. 8. Read terrain like an animal, not like a map. Understand where the wind scours, where snowfall shelters, which depressions collect shadow. Hunters become weather readers. Their cues are the cues of survival. 9. Anticipate countermeasures and prepare decoys. Simo and his comrades sometimes used false trails or left evidence that misled sweeping parties. Anticipation forces the opponent to commit to a choice, which can then be exploited. 10. Accept the human cost and cultivate discipline. Killing in war is corrosive. Those who perform it must maintain a professional focus that acknowledges moral weight. The Finns who recorded these rules did not present them as heroic trifles. They recorded them as hard-earned methods that carried consequences for psyche and soul. These rules were not arcana. They were a codified transfer of knowledge from decades of living outdoors into a wartime setting. They were repeated in after-action reports, in veterans' recollections, and in later tactical manuals that took interest in winter war case studies. Where doctrine had once been theoretical, these practices were empirically validated by survival and by effectiveness. As winter turned slowly toward spring, the tempo of operations escalated. On February 1st, Soviet forces launched larger coordinated offensives in multiple sectors, attempting to achieve breakthrough by weight rather than by subtlety. These attacks were supported by artillery plans that peppered likely defensive zones and by follow-on troops intended to exploit whatever gains were made. In such contexts, the micro-effects of a marksman's work could be both amplified and diminished. On the one hand, removing leaders and radio operators created delays in attack synchronization. On the other, the sheer mass of assault mitigated single-actor disruptions by overwhelming local resistance. Simo's interdictions did create cumulative friction. Several Finnish company reports attribute operational delays and increased casualty rates in advancing Soviet columns to the effect of targeted sniping. A machine gun silenced at a key moment could allow a skirmish line to slip away or to mount a more effective counterpunch. Conversely, the Soviet approach to dissolve the advantage by attrition reshaped the environment and increased Finnish suffering. Civilians caught in border zones, supply lines rendered precarious by craters and broken forests, and greater reliance on concealment that came with its own costs. Frozen limbs, exposure injuries, and the relentless psychological toll of being unable to relax even when off watch. Then came March 6th. The narrative arc that had balanced technique and mass skill and state reached its wrenching climax. On that day, during an operation in which artillery and infantry action had intensified across segments of the front, Simo was struck. The wound was catastrophic. Finnish medical reports indicate that a round, variously reported as a stray bullet among suppression fire, hit him in the head and lower jaw. He collapsed, and the immediate response was evacuation under fire. That evacuation was itself a small miracle. Medics and orderlies risked exposure to retrieve a single man whose absence would nevertheless reshape the morale of a company. Field triage, stretcher carries through churned snow, and then a hurried move to the nearest field hospital followed. In medical wards beneath the grey March sky, surgeons fought to save him. The wound was severe enough to cause loss of blood and consciousness. He was placed into a coma and underwent emergency procedures. The detailed notes in Finnish hospital logs describe prolonged surgeries, blood transfusions, and the slow process of cleaning debris and stabilizing bone fragments. In time, coma gave way to a fogged recovery, to the slow regaining of consciousness, and then to the patient work of relearning simple functions. The chronology of this recovery, evacuation, operation, coma, waking, reads like many wartime survival stories, but because the man had taken on symbolic weight, each step was recorded and later retold with a mixture of relief and gravity. The timing of the injury carried additional consequence. Less than a week after Simo's wounding, diplomatic channels produced the Moscow Peace Treaty of March 13, 1940, which ended hostilities between Finland and the Soviet Union. The treaty did not erase blood or death. It changed the terms of engagement and forced both sides into a political settlement shaped by exhaustion, strategic limits, and international pressures. For Simo, the end of active hostilities meant time to recover without risking a return to frontline exposure. For the wider conflict, the treaty set a boundary. Hostilities would not resume on the same scale for that moment in time, and the stories of daring and loss could be folded into national narratives. Surviving a wound so brutal left marks beyond the physical. Veterans' records and interviews gathered in the decades after the war traced the slow and uneven path of psychological recovery. Those who had killed or watched friends die carried silent burdens, numbness, the replaying of sounds in sleep, the strange detachment that can follow acute stress. Simo too reportedly carried ambivalence into later life. The sobriquet, White Death, remained, but the man beneath the name was known to prefer a quiet existence to public adulation. He accepted offers to visit troops and to instruct young marksmen in safe, controlled environments, and he allowed a measure of official commemoration. His rifle was preserved as an artifact, his image photographed for archival record, and his brief periods as an instructor reflected an effort by Finnish authorities to transfer hard-won local techniques into formal training. The post-war period consolidated myth and record in uneasy proximity. Finnish wartime logs credited him with an extraordinary number of confirmed sniper kills, often cited as exceeding 500 in later retellings. Historians urge caution in taking headline numbers at face value. Confirmed kills in wartime reports were subject to the fog of war, the pressures of morale, and the administrative desire to document success. Some Soviet-era records and later estimations offer lower figures or treat high numbers as inflated by rumor and propaganda. The responsible synthesis recognizes both the empirical records and the cultural amplification. Finnish documents do record an unusually high tally for a single marksman, and the narrative that grew around those numbers, White Death, the ghost in the snow, was itself a wartime weapon, wielded by words and fear as much as by rifle fire. That duality is part of the lesson. Numbers matter, but they do not tell the whole story. The psychological and tactical effects of a skilled marksman can ripple far beyond tallies. Militaries re-examine doctrine when their assumptions are disrupted by anomalous performance, and the Soviet response, creating counter-sniper units, integrating artillery mass and changing operational tempos, was a rational adaptation to an unusual problem. In retrospect, the Soviet state's ultimate weapon was not a single technology, but its ability to marshal overwhelming means, to change the battlefield's geometry through firepower, and to recast a tactical nuisance into a problem of logistics and attrition. Beyond that operational lesson lies a human one. Men and women who perform lethal tasks in war seldom carry public recognition without private consequence. Stories collected in veteran interviews tell of those who return to peacetime lives with a silence at dinner tables, a sense of distance in conversations, an effort to resume ordinary labor while navigating memories that would not be easily arranged into tidy narratives. Simo's own life after the war included long recovery, retirement from public combat roles, and a later quiet life, intermittently visiting commemorations, occasionally advising on marksmanship, and allowing the story of his wartime role to become part of Finland's national memory. The museum that houses the rifle and a small exhibit dedicated to winter war snipers serves as a physical locus for this complicated legacy. Objects, rifles, clothing, photographs have a potency that stories can both illuminate and obscure. A rifle in a glass case is at once a tool and an artifact. It is proof of human ingenuity and of the capacity to do harm. The exhibit frames the object with context, explanations of material limitations, the environment's role in shaping tactics, and the moral ambiguities that surround kill counts. Visitors stand and read, perhaps impressed by craft, perhaps pained by consequence. Museums can humanize history or school it into stark lessons. In the case of Simo's rifle, the curators sought to do both, present the technique and preserve the reflection. The long tail of Simo's influence extends into military education. Sniper schools and small unit instructors study case histories that distill practical lessons, the value of local knowledge, the use of camouflage adapted to season, the discipline of shot selection, the integration of snipers into larger tactical fabrics. At training academies around the world, analyses of winter war sniping routines appear as seminars on adaptability, how a state force might be locally superior in numbers but strategically vulnerable to focused disruption. Modern doctrine often balances concentration of force with decentralization, an awareness that even technologically inferior actors can produce disproportionate effects through knowledge and discipline. Yet the most persistent lesson concerns the dangerous marriage of myth and fear. Rumor, bolstered by propaganda, can shape behavior. A reported white death can franchise itself quickly. Soldiers with a fresh fear in their minds change how they move, commanders adjust plans defensively, and whole sections of terrain become contested in ways that numerical superiority alone cannot predict. The Soviet state's adoption of saturation tactics in part responded to this dynamic. The calculus shifted from targeting a man to transforming the ground he relied on. If one outcome of Simo's operations was tactical adaptation, another was the recognition that perception on the battlefield is itself an instrument. It is easy with a handful of heroic episodes to fall into caricature. The cinematic image, a solitary figure, iron-sighted rifle, breath visible in freezing air, lends itself to myth-making. But a sober approach keeps the human dimensions in view. The farmer who learned to shoot to feed his family, the commando tactics adapted from hunting, the millimeters between success and fatal error, the medics who carried him out under bombardment, and the men on the other side who, regardless of ideology or command, found themselves in the same calculus of fear and survival. War complicates the notion of hero. It renders heroism comparative, contingent, and costly. Returning to the title that opened this narrative, the provocative claim that one sniper killed 500 foes unscoped while the USSR's ultimate weapon was revealed, two clarifications are necessary. First, the numbers frequently attached to Simo's record should be understood in layers. Finnish wartime documentation credited him an extraordinary number of confirmed kills. Later retellings and some contemporary reports increased or questioned those totals. Where we speak of confirmed kills, we mean those listed in Finnish records. Where we speak of reported or legendary numbers, we indicate claims amplified in the fog of war. Second, the label USSR's ultimate weapon is not a claim of supernatural machinery or an unnamed singular device. It is a conceptual shorthand for the Soviet Union's operational response, a combination of counter-snipers, artillery saturation, aerial reconnaissance, and the institutional capacity to coordinate massed resources to blunt a tactical threat. History rarely affords tidy moral closure. The Winter War presents a dense weave of tactical innovation, human endurance, strategic miscalculation, and political consequence. Within that weave, Simo emerges as a fulcrum of contrasts, a hunter and a soldier, a man small in stature and large in effect, a craftsman whose quiet methods disrupted the assumptions of an industrial army. His story asks uncomfortable questions about the nature of effectiveness in war. When does skill become terror? When does tactical success become a moral burden? What responsibility do states bear when they answer asymmetric threats with overwhelming fire? The longer legacy is not the tally on a page, but the conversations that continue in military textbooks, in museum exhibits, and in veteran recollections. Students of strategy dissect Winter War case studies to understand adaptation under pressure. Instructors teach the value of environment-specific training and the danger of underestimating local expertise. Tacticians reflect on the ways concentrated assets can be allocated to reduce the influence of adversarial craft, yet they also note the human price of massed responses. The paradox is persistent. The more a state can marshal force, the more it must contend with the ethical dimensions of turning landscapes into instruments of attrition. In the end, the smallest details linger: the crack of a bolt, the smell of spent powder in frozen air, the muffled footfalls of men moving between trenches. They are not cinematic ornaments. They are memories that war imprints on those who live it. Simo's operations remind us that individual skill, when matched to favorable conditions, can have disproportionate effect. They also remind us that states will react sometimes by study and adaptation, sometimes by overwhelming response. The ultimate weapon in this story was not a single gun, but the combined capacity of an industrial state to reconfigure the battlefield. It was the choice to substitute volume for precision when precision threatened to unsettle broader plans. Decades later, visitors to the small museum that preserves artifacts from the Winter War stand before the Mosin Nagant and read placards that attempt to balance awe with sobriety. They learn of techniques adapted from hunting, of the constraints of cold, of the differences between a scoped rifle and iron sights in a blizzard. They are told of names: Simo, Captain Medvedev, Lieutenant Nikolaev, and the many unnamed men who walked the white aisles of that conflict. And they are invited to reflect on the price exacted on both sides. The labels on the wall are careful: confirmed and reported, tactical effect and human cost. Exhibition curators strive to hold both lessons together, the empirical and the ethical. If the narrative of one man's extraordinary wartime effectiveness carries allure, its value is not to glorify killing, but to teach. Military professionals extract from it techniques to be adapted with discipline. Historians extract from it cautionary notes about myth-making. Citizens extract from it a deeper sense of war's consequences. Simo's life, his suffering and recovery, his later quiet role advising young marksmen, and the rifle in its glass case form a composite that resists simple moralization. He was a product of his environment and his choices. His impact prompted an institutional response that reveals how states confront asymmetry in warfare. The story's final image returns us to that winter clearing. A small figure moving like a shadow, a rifle set once and then again, a breath that fogs and fades. The battlefield shifted in response, less because one man was invincible than because he revealed a vulnerability that could be exploited or neutralized by adaptation. The Soviet Union's ultimate weapon was thus its capacity to mobilize mass and coordination, not to outdo a man in marksmanship, but to alter the conditions that made his skill most effective. For viewers and students of history, that tension is instructive. Skill matters. So do resources. Local knowledge can be a decisive force multiplier. So can centralized power. Myths grow where fear meets uncertainty. Careful analysis can deflate legend without diminishing the vivid human story beneath it. Simo's record, documented in Finnish wartime logs and later discussed in scholarship, remains exceptional. How that record is framed, however, should be honest. We credit the confirmed tallies, note the disputed flourishes, and keep the human consequences at the center. If you want to explore this history further, consider watching our deep dive documentary on Winter War small unit tactics, or visit the archive links in the description to see primary documents and museum collections. If this story made you think about the nature of skill, adaptation, or the costs of war, subscribe for more detailed historical analyses and on-the-ground narratives that try to keep fact and reflection in balance.